Good evening, everyone. Wow, so great to see everyone in midterm flurry coming to hear a great talk. Thank you for coming this evening. It's great to see you. Lots of old and new friends, people who are at the university and other places. It's a real pleasure tonight to have Laura Wolf Powers with us. I am not, okay, go ahead, clap. That is good for 6 p.m. That is a great welcome. Thank you. Wow, we should do that. I wish you guys did that when I showed up for class every day. That would be awesome. So I am not a huge fan of reading bios. You can find that on all kinds of interwebs and things like that. But I will say that I've known Laura for a long time. We were at Rutgers at the same time when Laura was a student and I was a professor. We lived around the corner from each other for several years in Brooklyn before I came here. And Laura's been in and out of our classrooms for the last few years since I've been here and was a professor here at Penn. She's also taught at Pratt, at Columbia, at Harvard, and is currently a professor at Hunter College in New York City. And I think that probably part of the work that she's presenting tonight, which comes from her hot off the presses book, University City, which is in the back, published by Penn University Press, was probably birthed when you were here, right? In terms of really looking at what's been going on in this part of town in Philadelphia. And those of you who are our students, you know that it's been kind of a fraught relationship between the university and the community here at Penn. I want to just shout out Amy Hillier, who's here too, who put that class together, the Penn and, yes, the Penn experience. And I'm really excited about this talk tonight. Laura's going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes. We'll have time for questions and answers. And thank you so much for coming and being with us. You're mic too, but you can use this if you want.
Yeah, I'm going to see if I can just project.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah, is that good? Good volume? Okay, great. So thank you, Lisa, for that very warm introduction. I'm really delighted to be here tonight, and I just want to say how much joy it is bringing me to see so many former colleagues and former students in the audience. It makes me very happy. And I'm really touched that you came out on a Thursday night for this. My presentation tonight is two bargaining tables, reflecting on activist encounters with university-led redevelopment in West Philadelphia at two moments, 1969 and 2017. This talk is adapted from my new Penn Press book, University City, which traces a half-century of redevelopment policy and civic activism in, well, right here. I think they're calling it Silicon Valley now, is that right? So University City is interesting to look at because it's an urban neighborhood in which municipal officials, academic institutions, and mobilized community advocates have been engaged over many decades in conversations and arguments about space, political voice and resources, and the question of who benefits from and who sacrifices as a result of university-sponsored redevelopment and related economic and social policies. In trying to understand what has changed and what has not changed between the urban renewal era and the present day when it comes to redevelopment policy and politics, I reviewed hundreds of archival documents, interviewed dozens of people, and attended monthly meetings of a local civic association, the Mantua Civic Association, over the course of about 18 months in 2015 and 2016. So the book is very much about West Philadelphia, but it is broadly concerned with the conditions generated by property market appreciation all across North America in areas that are adjacent to university-led redevelopment, or as they are now termed in the policy literature, innovation districts. And what I conclude in terms of a policy takeaway is that property-driven economic development, and that is what I argue that innovation district development largely is, can only succeed in meeting equity and inclusion goals if cities and universities are willing to take a different approach to land and housing markets in neighborhoods adjacent to campus expansion projects. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, but I'm going to start with a bargaining table. So at 11 a.m. on Tuesday, February 18th, 1969, a frigidly cold day, roughly 400 people assembled on the green in front of the University of Pennsylvania's College Hall in preparation for a march. They were responding to a call from the university's chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, whose leaders were determined to cast light on the devastating consequences of university-led expansion a few blocks from campus. The demonstrators' destination was a construction site at 36 and Market Street in University City Urban Renewal Area 3, where the University City Science Center, which is what you see at the top, and a new public high school, University City High School, were soon to rise on what had 6 years earlier been a neighborhood of 69 businesses and 1,407 homes. A residents group, the Citizens Community for University City Urban Renewal Area Unit 3, had obtained a commitment from the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority to build replacement housing in this area, specifically the area where the lower yellow arrow is pointing. But the Redevelopment Authority had broken this promise, and the plight of displaced or soon-to-be displaced residents, particularly people who had been homeowners in this neighborhood, had gotten the attention of radicalized students from Penn and other area universities. "This is your day," the students were told by Reverend Edward Sims, a leader representing the residents of the neighborhood known as Greenville or the Black Bottom. "The university has taken some 30 acres of land from the blacks of this community. Are you good enough to get some of it back for us?" After staging a theatrical performance designed to dramatize the legalized dispossession being carried out by the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority on behalf of local universities, the shivering demonstrators returned to College Hall, where they intercepted University President Gaylord Harnwell on his way back from lunch. In addition to being Penn's president, Harnwell was also the president of the West Philadelphia Corporation, a multilateral organization which constituted the main source of power behind the Science Center and other university expansion in West Philadelphia. Aggrieved students proceeded to sit in the College Hall building for the next 5 days as they negotiated a set of demands, first among themselves and then with university trustees. On Sunday, February 23rd, the trustees and the students, with the support of the Faculty Senate and a delegation of West Philadelphia Black leaders, released a 6-point agreement that ended the students' occupation of the building. The trustees had agreed 2 days previously that the Science Center would expressly agree not to accept secret, classified, or military-related research contracts. So there were kind of 2 sets of demands in this sit-in. And moreover, the trustees had agreed to form an inclusive, multilateral group to set the terms of the university's development activities in West Philadelphia going forward. They had also agreed to raise $10 million, this is a quote, raise $10 million for community renewal programs while rebuilding housing demolished by university construction. Students and community activists and Penn trustees ended the February 1969 student occupation of College Hall with an agreement to create a commission on university community development, consisting of 5 student representatives, 5 faculty members, 5 trustees, and 5 community members. This quadripartite commission had 2 stated purposes. First, the commission was empowered to review and approve plans involving future land acquisition or development in the urban renewal area. Although the University City Science Center and University City High School were by that point under construction, not all the property in Unit 3 had been transferred to the Redevelopment Authority, and the area still contained some occupied housing. As chartered, the commission supposedly had authority both to provide a check on the university's future expansion and to participate in decision-making as development activity in this area progressed. Second, the commission would oversee and direct a fund of $10 million, which equates to about $80 million in current dollars, that the university would make available for community development. And reading what the agreement said, the Board of Trustees individually and collectively agree to concert their efforts, blah, 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 to develop the funds and funding sources needed for community renewal. And if looking at these quotes, they seem maybe a little bit tortured and potentially problematic to you, you're right, because that did not happen. Although it would take more than a year for the commission to officially fall apart, fault lines were immediately evident. At the group's first meeting on March 10th, 1969, community representatives expressed an eagerness to proceed with the rehabilitation work they believed the February Agreement had authorized them to undertake through local organizations. Faculty Representative Russell Akoff proposed that the commission incorporate as a community development corporation that would receive university funds, which might then be distributed to groups working on the ground. However, there was no consensus about whether and how university funds would flow to local organizations. Community representatives imagined creating a core development staff and then drawing on the university's $10 million commitment to finance housing construction and rehabilitation, as well as other projects. It gradually became clear, though, that the university did not intend to contribute its own funds. The agreement had stated, after all, that only that the trustees would concert their efforts to develop funds and funding sources. The Quadripartite Commission never incorporated. In December 1969, faculty representative John W. Ekman instructed the university's legal counsel to halt the process, citing the danger that the incorporation will only serve to focus undesirable and perhaps critical scrutiny on the interpretation of the trustees' much-debated $10 million promise of last February. While the university and the West Philadelphia Corporation contributed a few $100,000 to local organizations in the years that followed, the ambiguous $10 million commitment in the February Agreement was never fulfilled. There was further conflict over the Quadripartite Commission's authority over future development planning for the urban renewal area. So this was a quite large area of about 82 acres. As community representatives, student representatives, and some faculty representatives understood it, the sit-in agreement empowered the commission to revisit the question of how to save parts of the Black Bottom from demolition. This interpretation of the commission's role, however, was not acceptable to the university. In late April 1969, when the body passed a resolution requesting a temporary setting aside of all present expansion plans so that some sites could be re-examined as potential locations for housing retention, university administrators equivocated. Their efforts to avoid even discussing the resolution, let alone implementing it, made the commission's powerlessness evident. It faltered, and its members voted to dissolve in 1971. So, okay, that was this 1969 bargaining process. And before I move on, I'm going to sort of reiterate the actors in that process. So sitting at the negotiating table were the university trustees, activist students and faculty, and leaders such as Reverend Sims and others representing the affected neighborhoods. Not in the room, but very much in the background, were the government entities, federal housing officials and the local redevelopment authority, and also the university entities, namely the West Philadelphia Corporation, who were sponsoring and financing the redevelopment that was leading to this displacement of households. I now, in the interest of time, fast forward 50 years to 2012, when Drexel University introduced a new campus plan and strategic plan that sort of reimagined the neighborhood adjacent to the campus. And this, Lisa alluded to the fact that I taught here, and this was a moment when I was teaching a community development course, which I ended up structuring around neighborhood dynamics and neighborhood change in this area, the lower Lancaster corridor, so along Lancaster Avenue and the neighborhoods on either side of it. And this was, so this strategic plan, in stating that the officials intended to create a 21st century district marked by livability, amenity, and accessibility, unquote, extending from 30th to 36th Streets and from Chestnut Street to Powelton Avenue, was clear about its intention to enlarge the area of University City that students, employees, and visitors would identify with Drexel. In a speech in 2013, Drexel President John Fry alluded to a series of mixed-use projects built in partnership with private developers, which he believed to be the future of major university development. And U City Square, taglined "A Community of Ingenuity," was in fact announced in September 2015 on this site that's outlined in red. A second innovation district plan, Schuylkill Yards, was announced the following year. And this development, much like U City Square, featured a variety of mixed use, live, work, play development on university land using a ground lease structure, which is important to the story. While the Schuylkill Yards Innovation District was destined for an area currently occupied by disused industrial buildings and a surface parking lot, the U-City Square Innovation District was set to be located in this area north of Market Street between 36th and 38th, an area that had been the epicenter of this 1969 conflict. And in order to initiate U-City Square, Drexel and its development partner, Wexford Science and Technology, had to acquire the site of the University City High School, whose construction had played a large role in the clearance of the Black Bottom neighborhood in the late 1960s. At that time, the West Philadelphia Corporation had maneuvered to have the school constructed rather than the replacement housing that the Redevelopment Authority had promised to organized residents. By the 2010s, University City High School was struggling, and it had ended up on a list of schools that the Philadelphia School District planned to close due to low enrollments. And you can see it here in 2015 in the midst of the demolition that took place over the course of the year. I believe I see Elaine. Elaine Simon took that picture and many others of this building in various stages of dismantling. Okay, so while all this was going on, there were other planning processes occurring in neighborhoods along the lower Lancaster corridor, and specifically in Powelton Village and Mantua. In 2011, the Powelton Village Civic Association released its directions plan, and then in 2013, the Board of Directors of the Mount Vernon Manor Community Development Corporation published the Mantua Transformation Plan as part of a federal Choice Neighborhoods Planning grant. In contrast to the Drexel Campus Plan, these two plans expressed the interests and the anxieties of residents whose neighborhoods stood to be affected by the development of the two innovation districts, multi-billion-dollar projects. These organizations saw university-led redevelopment on the horizon, and in that context, they were asserting their own claims on place. So I'm leading us toward the second bargaining table here because these are two of the main groups who ended up in community benefits negotiations in the ensuing years. I'm particularly interested in the Mantua Transformation Plan because it really lays out the intention of incumbent residents in that neighborhood to maintain the neighborhood's identity in the midst of change. This plan spawned the Mantua Civic Association, which is a group of leaders pursuing development in their neighborhood that they see as compatible with the community's character, namely renter and owner-occupied housing units affordable to people with stable but relatively low incomes. As I noted, I attended meetings of this group over the course of about 18 months, and I talk a lot about them in the book. Here are some statistics and photos that illustrate what was happening to the Mantua neighborhood at the time of this plan and shortly afterward. What this reflects is the increasing development in Mantua of housing marketed to students and the increasing expectation of property price appreciation as these live, work, play, innovation neighborhoods took place about 10 blocks to the south. And I'm going to grab a copy of the book because I wanted to read from it. So, excuse me. Mantua Civic Association leaders briefly explored a campaign to advocate for a moratorium on property tax increases in this neighborhood. But city housing officials were already instigating property tax relief for people with lower fixed incomes, particularly seniors. The larger issue was that many of the same homeowners with rising tax assessments were also behind on mortgage payments and utility bills. Loss of ownership through foreclosure was common, and to avoid this fate, many people were selling their homes for cash to real estate companies whose interest was in the land. The value of many of these properties from the standpoint of a real estate transaction was independent of the value of the houses that stood on them. The time and care that residents or former residents had invested in their homes and yards and the symbolic attachments they had to them were, in the domain of real estate economics, worthless. The 2014 Funeral for a Home project, in which the Mantua Civic Association was a key collaborator along with some students from the Tyler School of Art at Temple, poignantly highlighted this dilemma by staging an elaborate ceremony complete with a choral performance and a procession to the junkyard to deposit remains. And you can see sort of the funereal wreath on the top of the cornice of the house there. And this concerned the planned demolition of one home at 3711 Mellon Street. So the bottom line, let me go back. Powelton Village's story is a little bit different because the residents of that neighborhood are more affluent and less racialized, but Powelton residents also struggle with investor-owned housing in their neighborhood. And as we'll see shortly, the alliance between the Powelton Village Civic Association and the Mantua Civic Association was at the core of the second bargaining process that I'm going to talk about. The bottom line here is that residents of the neighborhoods near the innovation districts understood what was at stake as the area started to change, and they were determined to exert an influence. The first opportunity to do that came with a community benefits process initiated by Councilwoman Janie Blackwell in 2014, just before Drexel purchased the University City High School from the Philadelphia School District. A March 2014 community input session in Charette drew over 100 participants representing multiple civic organizations. A workshop followed at which leaders representing Mantua, Powelton Village, and West Powelton collaborated with volunteer architects to articulate community priorities for the reuse of the empty school site. When Drexel and Wexford sought City Council approval for an upzoning just a few weeks later, Councilwoman Blackwell pledged not to move the legislation forward until the redevelopment partners had negotiated a community benefits agreement with the organizations. Negotiations were tense and frenzied, and Drexel's and Wexford's lawyers sat across from a lawyer hired by the Powelton Village Civic Association. When the City Council announced the agreement on June 14th, 2014, its terms were geared towards the priorities articulated in the Community Input and Design Workshop document that you see here. Among these were restrictions on building heights at the northern part of the site, an assurance that any housing on the site would not be constructed for or marketed to students, the inclusion of parking podiums to keep parked cars off neighborhood streets, and the articulation of a joint goal to create a public school as part of the University City Square development, which is a little ironic because they had just torn the school down, but now they were trying to. The agreement also set forth some terms on which Drexel would provide financial assistance to neighborhood schools, and it provided for the formation of a community advisory group. Finally, as an additional exhibit, not part of the community benefits agreement itself, there was an economic opportunity plan setting targets for female, minority, and local resident participation in construction employment on this project. The Economic Opportunity Plan was a legal requirement and constituted a standard feature of major projects requiring city approvals or subsidy in Philadelphia. Powelton Village Civic Association members were generally pleased because their priority had been to have the new development harmonize with the neighborhood context and create a continuation of neighborhood fabric as opposed to something disruptive. The Mantua participants were less than thrilled. They had sought an affordable housing requirement and more attention to economic inclusion and jobs. In other words, they were looking for the agreement not just to mitigate the impact of new development on the landscape, but to address social distress in a way that began to repair past harms. Due to long experience engaging with Drexel and better organizational resources and political capital, the Powelton Village contingent had led the negotiation, and the resulting agreement primarily reflected their interests. Ultimately, Mantua representatives had been at the table for discussions that were largely about site design. And you can see this quote from one of the members of the Civic Association. All they wanted to talk about was parking and trees. So they learned from this. I'm talking about the Mantua Civic Association now, and they were very active going into the second University City Community Benefits negotiation of the 2010s, the one for the Schuylkill Yards development. Here, they wanted to win some gains that would enable them to stabilize current Mantua homeowners and build new, deeply affordable housing. The Schuylkill Yards Innovation District, announced in 2016, was a partnership between Drexel and a hometown developer, Brandywine Realty Trust, to develop 10 acres that the university had assembled on the east side of its campus near the 30th Street train station. Drexel's John Fry and Jared Gerard H. Sweeney of Brandywine Realty Trust introduced the project in March 2016, unveiling a dramatic before and after rendering that juxtaposed a dull scene of highways, surface parking, and railroad tracks with an image of 8 towers of varying heights springing from a verdant garden-like base. The development would be built in at least 2 phases, offering research labs, corporate offices, residential and retail spaces, and hospitality and cultural venues. And once again, Councilwoman Blackwell insisted on a community benefits agreement before greenlighting the necessary rezoning. For the U-City Square negotiation in 2014, Blackwell had called numerous groups to the table, and conflict had emerged as some groups had advocated particularistic interests or attempted backdoor negotiations with Wexford outside of the official discussion forum. In the Schuylkill Yards case, perhaps having learned from this experience, Blackwell, in the words of one interviewee, set the table, but left it to Brandywine to decide who would sit there. By the fall of 2016, Brandywine had apparently determined that its negotiating partner would be a coalition of organizations that called itself the Mantua-Powelton Alliance. This included the Mantua Civic Association, the Mount Vernon Manor CDC, the Powelton Village Civic Association, and the People's Emergency Center CDC. Strategic cohesion among these groups had begun with the University City High School negotiations and continued as several grants had come in, a Promised Neighborhoods designation and a Promised Zone designation. And there was also quite a bit of community engagement in these neighborhoods by Drexel that drew these organizations together. The 4 groups had built enough mutual trust to present themselves to Brandywine as an authentic representative of the community's interests, and they were in the midst of negotiating with Brandywine when the Planning Commission heard testimony in January 2017. And so these are a couple of remarks that 2 of the negotiators traded with each other via a reporter on that day of the City Planning Commission hearing. And it makes clear some of the issues that were at stake in the negotiation. From Brandywine's perspective, it was absurd to hold a private company responsible for outcomes in the neighborhoods on the fringes of its investment. But John Phillips, the president of the Powelton Village Civic Association, had concerns. And Mantua organizations also present at the meeting were bringing the issue of affordable housing forcefully into the public conversation about the Schuylkill Yards project. What they were doing in the CBA negotiation, in addition to asking for mitigative measures to ensure the development fit with the city fabric and didn't cause too many nuisances, was asking for a figure that some people considered to be outrageous, $72 million in cash, which they intended to use to provide programming for economically disadvantaged youth and to acquire land on which mission-driven organizations could build deeply affordable housing. If some commentators thought it was inappropriate for community groups to be making asks of Brandywine, other commentators thought the entire community benefit process was a poor substitute for what should have been a deeper critique of the development. There were a lot of layers of federal, state, and city subsidy that went into this project. And while Drexel and Brandywine advanced a narrative that positions subsidized property investment by the private sector as self-evidently and universally desirable, good for the city, good for the region, good for everyone, some felt that this narrative was conflating real estate return with broadly beneficial economic development. And it failed to account for the collateral impact that the project would have on low socioeconomic status households, absent an effort to decommodify land and housing in their neighborhoods. So this was the CBA that was ultimately reached, some key aspects of it. Brandywine did commit to confer with community groups on things like traffic and congestion. They pledged to provide 6.5 acres of public open space, and ultimately, the groups did not get the $72 million, but they got a total of about $9 million or $620,000 annually for a community fund for 10 years. So now I'm going to engage in some comparative reflection on the 2 negotiations, the College Hall sit-in in 1969 and the Schuylkill Yards Community Benefits negotiation 48 years later in 2017. So one continuity is that you had the expansion plans of universities and their institutional imperatives affecting neighborhoods adjacent to them, whether through primary or secondary displacement. And another kind of common theme, in the 1960s, it was the Science Center. I believe the mayor, James Tate, at the time said, oh, Philadelphia is going to be the brains capital of the world now because we have the Science Center. Similarly, there was this idea that marrying academic research with commercial applications in this specific place where people would have contact with each other and inspire each other and develop relationships, that this was really the key to economic prosperity in the knowledge economy. But as part of the elevation of these new neighborhoods and the knowledge workers who were going to be coming to participate in them, they were devaluing the space of neighborhoods nearby. This is kind of part of many, many redevelopment playbooks. Wherever residential and commercial areas identified with minority groups are implicated in redevelopment planning, stigma creeps into the discourse. And when the redeveloper is a university, the rhetoric of stigmatization takes on an added significance because academic institutions lay special claim to qualities such as ingenuity, knowledge, and creativity that are purportedly central to the success of innovation districts. By implications, these qualities are seen to be absent from the materially poor communities of color nearby. And I'll just cite Akira Drake Rodriguez here. Acts of redevelopment are inseparable from racialized political geography. So in both cases, groups mobilized. In the 1960s, the Citizens Committee waged a very hard-fought campaign. I don't have time to talk about it tonight, but it's very, it's an interesting story. And in the 2010s, it was the Mantua-Powelton Alliance that was advocating for the interests of incumbent residents in the context of this innovation-driven development. So those are the continuities. What are some of the differences? Well, first of all, we think about redevelopment planning very differently today. And it's very unusual, although I can think of one case not too far from this campus where there is direct displacement happening right now. But there is, typically we sort of think of ourselves as having moved beyond a time when we were destroying communities. We're more enlightened now. We've learned to be more ethical and more sensitive and so on. And there's this kind of contrition, oh, that would never happen again. So there's not any direct displacement, but that doesn't mean that there aren't impacts and ripple effects. Another difference is that at the time that the Science Center was being built, Philadelphia was hemorrhaging jobs and population. And now, for the past 20 years, there have been incremental gains in both population and employment. I mean, it's worth pointing out that there's still 200,000 fewer jobs here and 365,000 fewer people here than there were when the Science Center opened its doors. But it's the sense is that cities are increasingly attractive destinations for people with disposable income, and that's what makes investors like Wexford and Brandywine interested in doing projects like this. Government isn't really dedicating money to urban projects in any significant way. I mentioned that over the course of this time, parts of Mantua and West Powelton were declared a promise zone. But as one of my interviewees sort of quipped to me, he said, I can promise to take you to dinner, but at dinner time, you're still hungry. That's what he had to say about the promise zone. There just wasn't very many resources associated with it. A university, the university-sponsored innovation district has become kind of a standard product that is marketed to real estate investors. The ground lease payments that property developers make to universities on their tax-exempt land are unlike debt principal, they are deductible from corporate income tax, and there is an enormous amount of material advantage to partnering with the university and ground leasing land and developing. And then of course you have access as well to all the consumers in the university orbit. So it's become really part of a sort of a real estate industry playbook at this point. Another difference is that universities have been making significant investments, Penn has and Drexel has as well, in workforce development and education in adjacent neighborhoods. This is the Dornsife Center. It was established in 2016. They provide legal services, tutoring, entrepreneurship clinics, community meals. They did a lot of pandemic relief. Drexel has really, sort of doubled down by establishing this actual physical center right in the middle of the Mantua neighborhood. So that's a difference. Back in the 1960s, basically the tactic of the West Philadelphia Corporation was to pretend that the Citizens Committee that was trying to convince them, to save some of the housing in Unit 3, just to pretend that they didn't exist. They didn't answer their phone calls. They denigrated them. They said they created a narrative about one of their leaders, which was, really terribly racist, honestly. Now there's a big emphasis in kind of the university community arena on inclusion and social inclusion and stakeholder participation, and there are more opportunities for groups who are mobilized to get political representation and voice. And of course, it didn't hurt that Janie Blackwell, the councilwoman, was willing to hold up all these zoning approvals until there were community benefits agreements in place. So there's some things that have really improved, but there's still this stubborn issue of land. This is a map from the Mantua Transformation Plan showing public and privately owned vacant land in Mantua, and there was a lot of it at the time. This was 2014. There's probably substantially less now, the idea that the activists had was that maybe the city could acquire some of this land and turn it over to Mount Vernon Manor Community Development Corporation or other organizations, to kind of build up the quantity of stable, low-cost housing in the neighborhood. But it turned out the land bank, people who ran the land bank were really much more interested in trying to maximize revenue for the city, which is understandable because the budget of the city is in constant crisis. But there was a bill last year that was introduced actually by the council person for this district that would have given groups like community land trusts and CDCs priority for vacant lots. But people were not, Jamie Gautier's fellow council people were not particularly interested in it, partly because they wanted to continue to exert a lot of control over any development that was taking place in their district, and this would, at least in their view, threaten to undermine that. The recommendations that I make in my book are geared toward aggressive interventions that remove at least some land and housing from the speculative marketplace in order that people of moderate means can continue to live in these improving neighborhoods where amenities like public space, access to healthy food, and high-performing schools are going to be intensifying in the next few years. There are various funds that could stabilize homeowners, support for community land trusts. It's a difficult environment because it's very hard to build under our current housing regime. It's very hard to build housing for people with limited incomes. It just doesn't work with the kind of tax credit dominated system that we have right now. But these are some sort of concrete recommendations. There is an opportunity to do this right now, in that on 40th and Market Street, there is a housing development that a private owner has been operating under a contract with HUD. And these homes were built in the 1980s and on land that was part of the University City urban renewal area. And the affordability period required by that program has expired, and absent someone stepping in to purchase the property from its current owners, the residents there are going to be evicted at the end of the calendar year. I think something that's ironic about that is that those, the people who had been living in the University City townhomes now mostly dispersed, but there were a number of families with children, and those children are not going to be able to attend the new school that Drexel is building in the U City Square development. I have a few broader recommendations as well. The first is that we expand our definition of investment to cover investment that is non-financial in nature. Investment of time, investment of care, investment of social capital. This isn't actually my idea. I got it from a sociologist named Deborah Becker, who actually wrote a great book about Philadelphia a few years ago. But the idea is that economic development officials tend to focus on metrics like dollars of capital pledged and square feet to be constructed and leased. And activists or incumbent residents conceive of investment in ways that it's much more difficult to denominate in dollars or property values. And my argument is that planners need to honor this. The second recommendation has to do with how planners and economic development policy makers think about innovation. Reliance on real estate return as the animating force behind innovation-led economic development confines planners to the belief that only by attracting new residents and employees to newly constructed neighborhoods can cities generate vibrancy and prosperity. So this is the ANOVA housing in the U City Square development. This is what knowledge workers housing is supposed to look like. So you have economic success being measured by the arrival of people who are renting apartments in places like this one. But there are people. I would submit that there are people in older neighborhoods, less affluent neighborhoods as well. And it's true that they're not paying $2,500 a month in rent, but in what way does this disqualify them from being innovators? You can be an innovator. You don't have to live in an expensive apartment complex to be considered, somebody with something to contribute. And I interviewed many people in the course of my research who I think of as innovators. It's just that they couldn't afford that particular housing. So the third recommendation is about history. We have a responsibility, I believe, to recognize the ways that things like infiltration theory, the real estate color line, housing and labor market discrimination have prevented households of color from accumulating material wealth and social capital. And I think that we need to commit ourselves to doing more to repair that damage. So even now, and I'm just putting the recommendations up again, when we talk about equitable development and social inclusion, and those terms have become really commonplace, the community advocates are still operating in a milieu where a lot of this stuff seems really far-fetched. Kind of beyond the pale, right? And I think the political discourse reinforces a belief that low educational attainment, economic vulnerability, and encounters with the criminal justice system stem primarily from people's own limitations and their own poor choices and their pathology. So policy measures like these are considered unrealistic and unwarranted. And I think that's something that really hasn't changed enough since the days of urban renewal. So if we make some of the larger conceptual shifts I've suggested, it might become easier to persuade universities and city officials to adopt some of the policies that I've mentioned to ensure that low-income people living near university-sponsored redevelopment will be able to stay put and experience the benefits of innovation-based urban revitalization. Thank you. Sure, I'll do it. There in the back. Mm-hmm. I think I would answer that question by saying that I think Penn has an enormous opportunity here to do something that, regardless of whether technically speaking they're at fault, I think that the reparative power of the trustees moving forward and acquiring the University City Townhome site would be enormous, and I think that it would have benefits not only for the residents of the townhomes but for the university community. I think it would be a healing act. I recognize that $100 million is a lot of money, but it's not that much money considering. So I mean, so I guess I wouldn't. I'm sure you're right, and rather than getting to the technicalities of like whose land was whose when, I just think it's important to think about it, the opportunity to do something really transformative. Yes.
Hi, George Claflin from Design Advocacy Group, and we're very interested in University City townhomes. And I don't want to talk for too long, but I want to say a couple of things that point out some odd things that we have experienced in our efforts to get some constructive dialogue started on this. And we discovered, for example, that the Philadelphia City Planning Commission proposed a hotel for that site without ever mentioning it to the residents or anyone else. And it's actually published in the West Philadelphia plan. We also published 2 papers approved by our steering committee. In both papers, we advocated the preservation of the University City townhomes for the residents. And we encouraged Van Drexel and the Science Center to participate in this. None of the mainstream media would publish that. We tried very hard with the Inquirer and Plan Philly, nothing.
I sent an op-ed to the Inquirer as well.
No response. We find that, as you pointed out, implicitly in the University City townhomes crisis, I think Drexel and the Science Center are getting a free ride because the focus is on Penn, which of course is the most important, biggest institution and the dominant one. But Drexel and the Science Center have a tremendous role here, and the Science Center has 31 deep-pocketed members, including schools like Bryn Mawr and Swarthmore. And we feel that there is still time for a constructive negotiation because the eviction date has been continually moved forward. But what's happening now that's constructive? We have till December, which is coming, like a head-on collision, and we don't feel that there is negotiation. We hope there is, but we don't know about it. I'll stop there. And the question, to put that into question, do you have any advice on this?
I think organizing works. I think it's that Franklin Delano Roosevelt used to say to people in his cabinet who were kind of like more radical than he was, they would say, you need to do this, you need to, you need to pass unemployment insurance, you need to have Social Security, and he basically said, make me. Like what is required is sort of pressure from without that's so strong it can't be ignored. That would be my advice. Yes.
Yeah, hi. My name is Mike. I'm an undergraduate. I found it interesting in the case of the 1960s how you said there were kind of multiple demands in the students that were doing the city that had a lot of different issues on their mind and that they were asking for. I would say that probably something similar is happening today. I don't know how much you keep up with things that are still happening on Penn's campus, but one of the divestment lot of things on their mind as well. It's conceptualizing climate justice as something global and also related to this community. So I guess in the 60s, how would you say this anti-war movement and the community action is coming together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sit-in was a real zoo. I mean, in the sense that there were a lot of different groups with kind of groups that were more moderate, groups that were left, groups that were far left, and everybody. And it was a time of like ferment, and everybody was protesting the Vietnam War, and there was a sense that the country was over-militarized and that the Science Center was going to contribute to this destructive military research, and that was a big issue of concern. And then also there was the Black liberation struggle, which students became aware of, and in part through consciousness raising that was sort of happening in local politics in a general way. But it was a kind of, my impression, based on what I was able to learn in the archives about that whole sit-in, is that it was enormously contentious, and it was kind of a miracle that an agreement was reached at all, and because there were so many different kind of sectarian demands being put forward. I don't know. I've noticed as well that the University City Townhomes advocacy is paired with fossil-free pen advocacy, and I think tactically that may not be the best idea. At the same time, I recognize that every struggle is connected, and so it's a tough one. But I think it was just as much of an issue at the time, I think, as it is now. And I think I'll say one other thing, which is that it was kind of the Black leaders at the time from places like Tabernacle Presbyterian Church and from the Young Great Society and the Mantua Community Planners, which were two Mantua-based groups. It really has to have been kind of galling to them to, like, in order to get their voices heard and their issues getting on the agenda, like to have to like sort of attach themselves to these student radicals who were like 19 years old and like thought they knew everything. Must have been a really kind of uncomfortable and awkward dynamic. But you did sort of, for the first time, you saw that members of Black-led community organizations on campus participating in discussions about what the university's responsibilities were, and I think that was a good thing. But then, of course, as I explained, it all really fell apart rather quickly. Charles?
Yeah, I appreciate reading your book because it's actually resonated with some of the research that I recently done in Vancouver from my fieldwork on dissertation about Chinatown conservation and various groups that are involved in that. There's this issue there that I think is probably everywhere that just strikes out. I just noticed so much there that nonprofits will go to the city and say, it might be implicated in the planning process. The nonprofits, and these are small nonprofits, but within the context of the neighborhood, they have some power. They'll say, we have our mission, we have our bylaws, we have our board, which has just done a strategic planning process, we have everything. We've got all our ducks in a row. Now you're coming in here with a plan that the community's going to tell us what to do with our land. We're not going to participate. In fact, we're going to oppose it unless we get a guarantee that the plan is going to be consistent with our mission and consistent with our strategic plan. And to me, it's kind of that rubs me the wrong way. And I, especially as government kind of, and government's weak there too, in some ways weaker than it is here. And I kind of like, if planners that are working in these nonprofits or places like Penn say, I focus on the mission, anything that's distracting from the mission, you can't do it. How do you change that? Because I feel like it's not reasonable for a nonprofit to say, well, we've got our mission and that's it. And you can't, what are you to question? Because I feel like they're just acting like Brandywine or a private company.
So are you talking about the civic groups?
No, I'm just talking in general about nonprofits and their attitudes that
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, I mean, I think it would have gone a long way if if the city had been more proactive in itself. I mean, the whole thing was that back in the 1960s, the Mantua Community Planners Organization, which I talked about in the book, formed because they were worried that what had happened in the Black Bottom was going to happen in their neighborhood, and they basically created a whole autonomous plan, and ultimately it HUD said they couldn't implement it, and so I mean, I guess I see it from a slightly different perspective. I think that there's a lot of grassroots planning that happens that that city governments feel threatened by, and so I think that if there is a responsible planning process that's organized by a city government, and it's done in consultation with the community, then yeah, I think that something can be reached where they kind of move forward together, and there's not kind of antagonism. But I don't see the city making proactive plans that are aligned with the sort of equity goals that the not-for-profits often have. So that's yes. Black shirt with white.
My name's Apu, and I'm a medical student who works at the townhomes. We're trying to organize UPHS, the health system, and CHOP to come to the table to benefit townhomes residents, because a lot of them are longtime patients of the health system. And I think one of the problems we're running into is wondering where the negotiating table actually is, or might emerge. It seems for this issue, it's emerged around, in your book, it's emerged around the community benefits agreements, but I'm wondering what are some other sites where it's emerged, or where it might emerge for the townhomes.
Well, right, because it's a privately owned site, and yeah, it doesn't seem like anyone's interested in populating a bargaining table aside from the people who want to save the townhomes at this point. So yeah, I mean, I think part of what I will say I haven't followed it super closely, but I think part of the advocacy that has been happening has been kind of essentially trying to force the institutions in the city, and I completely agree with the person who said that Drexel and the Science Center institutions are also, could also play a positive role in that process. But the demand seems to be create a negotiating table and sit down with us, and the institutions are sort of saying, well, there's no need for a table because this is out of our hands. So I don't know quite how to suggest that change, except that I think organizing has been very effective, and I think people are doing a pretty good job of keeping it in the public conversation. I would just say keep going. Yes.
Hey, thank you so much for coming. I'm Dr. McNamara. I'm really interested in how you brought up different tactics of memory keeping. It was really intriguing to see that moment, and just for context, I've worked with folks in the Upper Lancaster area, and they mentioned to me the funeral for a home sort of demonstration that you brought up. I'm wondering in your book, do you go into it all, the moment in which this area became branded as University City? I'm curious about the tension with erasure and the branding of this as an innovation district, and there's just in your list the sort of recommendations of things that you've mentioned are just sort of out of pale. One thing that I've noticed is just the tension with calling University City. It automatically puts people into this head state of well, okay, we're doing you a favor by including you in this new prosperity agenda for this area, versus this was already a beautiful place, amazing place, and you came and colonized it. So I'm just curious about the framing of University City, culturally, and how that factors into sort of memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that was the origin point of that was in the late 1950s, and there was some sort of correspondence with. At the time, there was a amendment to the 1959 Housing Act that allowed university contributions to count toward the local match that cities were required to. If they wanted federal urban renewal funding, there had to be a local match. And the 1959 Housing Act revision said that local match can come from a university. So lots of cities got interested in and universities were already interested in expanding. And, again, I should say, like, this was a time when it was a real sense of, like, economic decline and crisis, right? So but there was a moment, I think it was in 1959 or 1960, where the West Philadelphia Corporation was founded, and suddenly the redevelopment authority had there were these renewal areas or redevelopment areas that had already been mapped out, but the redevelopment authority suddenly started referring to all of the ones in this area as University City Urban Renewal Area, and so that, and then there was a lot of. Maybe Edward can speak to this because he studied a lot of the publications that the West Philadelphia Corporation, put out, kind of trying to consolidate an identity for University City as being a kind of precinct where, university-affiliated families could feel safe and be well educated, and there was just like a lot of institutional effort that went into that. So that was kind of the moment. Yes.
Just a quick thing on there. What do you think the role of the Business Improvement District has been in that?
You're talking about the University City
Yes.
District? Wow. I think that the University City District has a mandate from the institutions that fund it, and to kind of consolidate the image of University City, or not only the image, but the reality of University City as a livable place, right? And sort of in a place that's clean, a place that's safe, right? But then you have to kind of get into these questions of like, clean for whom, safe from whom, and immediately these kind of boundary issues start arising. But I will say that I think among business improvement districts that I've encountered, I think UCD does some really interesting work with career pipelines, and I have a lot of respect for some of the work that they do on that level. But at the end of the day, like if you want to understand an institution, you just have to look at the money that perpetuates it year to year. You get a lot of insight.
Let's take one more.
Hi, I just moved here 3 years ago to West Philadelphia, and I was wondering. Hi, Laura. I was wondering if in your studies if there are models of other universities in either this country or some other place in which the university actually works to uplift the whole community by, paying taxes or helping to fund the public transportation system instead of setting up a public transportation system that's only for Penn that follows along behind the city buses, or we see these enormously public fightbacks where people try to save a building or a neighborhood, but as soon as Penn drops money on a school, which they just did to an elementary school, then that immediately ripples out into the property values and will change the ability of people to be able to live here. Whether they've been here for generations or whether they just got here and they're senior citizens, for example. So I just wonder if you
back
can.
to my point about taking land out of the marketplace.
Yeah. So if you can just tell us if there are any places in the world that you know of where universities behave differently rather than just being the big power grabber. Thanks.
I think it's a matter. I think it's a matter of degree. and universities are serving a lot of different constituencies. They're serving the students, they're serving the students' parents, they're serving the alumni, and they are also part of communities. I think, I don't know, my son just started college in the 5-college region up in Amherst, where Mount Holyoke and Amherst and Hampshire and UMass Amherst are. And on the basis of not that much real knowledge, I want to say that those institutions are kind of, collaborating. I mean, that's a different situation because it's a rural area, but there's a lot of farmland around there, and there's a lot of farmland preservation, and there's like a lot of concern, or a lot of cooperation among the institutions to make sure that water resources don't get depleted in times of drought. And so that's one that comes to mind, in terms of an urban university. I'm afraid that I don't have a great example for you. But it's a great question.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Yes.
Right? So thank you.